Okay. For the meeting of the July 22nd Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority Community Oversight Committee has been called to order by Chair Biggs, beginning with roll call. Member Scott Pinsky will not be with us this afternoon, starting with Rebecca Suggs.
Present.
Pat Randolph.
Here.
Larry Minikis.
Present.
John McCauley.
Yep, I'm here.
Bruce Bartell. Here. Vice Chair Wagner.
Present.
And Chair Biggs. Here. We do have a quorum and may proceed. We do have to call for roll call since Member Suggs is in the remote environment.
I think we can go first. Do we have any members of the public?
We do not. It's good practice to say it if you'd like, or I can.
You want me to do the whole spiel? Okay. The public is welcome to address the Community Oversight Committee at this time on matters not on the agenda that are within the jurisdiction of the committee. Please be advised that pursuant to the Government Code Section 54954.2, the committee is not permitted to discuss or take action on any matter not on the agenda. Comments may be no longer than 2 minutes and should be respectful to the community. And please silence your cell phones during the meeting, mute your microphone when not reporting out. With no members of the public on, however, we can go ahead to Executive Officer's oral report.
Good afternoon, everybody. We are just starting our new fiscal year. Amazingly, it's our 7th fiscal year. It's come by fast. And very happy with where we're at as an organization as far as our work productivity. As you guys are pointing out, though, time for us to get a little bit more mature and a little bit more problematic, whatever type of word that is, with our financial practices and get them locked down a little bit more of a better routine that has cleaner starts and stops, and that's what we'll talk about later on, is about the starts and stops of the data. But work plan wise, I'm really happy with the work plan as it's going. As we thought, the number of new projects when we first started versus new projects now and maintenance of existing projects is going well. One project I'm excited about that I mentioned during the board meeting, following Mill Valley's lead of having a comprehensive evacuation plan, the city of San Rafael is contracting with Ladris for the creation of a comprehensive evacuation plan. So that's going to be in the 26-27 work plan, and hoping that other agencies see the success that I predict that San Rafael will have in making this plan and decide we want to do that too. Having the city of San Rafael do it by themselves for the zone makes sense. In Nevada, it makes sense for Nevada to do it alone. When we get into the Ross Valley, I think it needs to be a Ross Valley zone project. I think the communities in the Ross Valley are too small to try to plan that on their own. Rather, it should be one plan with all of the law enforcement agencies coming together. So super happy about that. And fire season is acting like an average fire season right now. We don't have anything explosive happening out there. There was a 1,000-acre fire out in Sonoma, Pleasanton area yesterday, which for July in that area in the grass, it's not an unheard of fire. So we've had a couple little starts here and there in Marin. They've behaved the way they should behave. So nothing extraordinary. However, wait till September and October and see what happens. And then I'll close with the East Bay has been watching Marin Wildfire for several years now, and they have created what's called the East Bay Wildfire Coalition of Governments. It's not a joint powers authority, but it is a coalition of governments that are operating under a memorandum of understanding. And they're just trying to find a path from where they're at to where we're at and see how they can get there. So this morning I was at the Oakland City Hall where they were holding the East Bay Coalition meeting, and gave about a 20-minute presentation and had about 40 minutes of Q&A. And as I was walking out, the fire chief from Oakland is going, "Can I get your contact info? I saw about 10 things I want to get from you guys." And so, and as always, anything that we've created if we are happy to give it to anybody so that they can follow our path, because the more work we have throughout the state, the better it is for all of us. Whether it's smoke impacts coming from another county coming into here, or insurance. If we're going to have solutions to insurance, it can't just be one county. It has to be everybody. So, with that, I'll take questions.
I would just have a comment that the community fire evacuation plan, way harder than you think it is.
I know. they always are.
The Mill Valley one took us several years to get to an answer that really made sense. But Lattice has got enough data that you can try it 100 different ways. And then you have to really try to operationalize it. Our last year when we learned a lot.
Yeah.
It'd be the way I would describe how our latest plan went.
And they've brought in some subject matter experts as a consultant team. The initial attack incident commander from the Camp Fire is one of their consultants. Gentleman that I've worked with on many, many fires is another one of their consultants. Between the two of them, they've been involved in the evacuations of hundreds of thousands of people. So bringing that type of subject matter expertise is going to be helpful for them. But John, you're right, it's a big lift.
Do these exercises ever end up refining the genesis plans and zones or anything?
No, any refinements might be they during an exercise they may find one of the zones was too big, too small, or had the wrong break point. So that's sometimes they'll find
A
out.
little bit like that.
So not knowing anything about this is probably what I'm going to ask is a naive question, but how many zones or cities or communities in West or in Marin have evacuation plans?
The entire county has an evacuation plan.
Uh-huh.
It's the level of detail that Mill Valley came to that said, this is where we're going to put traffic control. This is where we're going to have contra flow. That we do have an entire plan for the entire county. It's the minute details that Mill Valley did. And John, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the big aha moments for them was when they were doing the analysis with Google was they were only looking at Blythedale and Shoreline Highway as their on-ramps because Hamilton was a one-way street. And then they had the aha moment where it had turned Hamilton into a two-way street. And now we just added our on-ramps by 50%. And so that was,
That's close enough, yeah, right.
that's the type of aha moment other agencies might be able to realize.
And we also looked at our particular topography with the dangers up in the hills. Right, so you want to get people down the hills as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And working with Tom Welsh, we actually had one of our detailed runs showed, when you reach a point of safety, which the fire guy said is in these areas, which was quite interesting. And we were the first people we could tell globally that has done a community level evacuation plan with the precision of geolocating every single property, every single car rather, and running it down real streets. So it was pretty groundbreaking.
Mm. And Mill Valley is the only place in Marin that has done that so far to that degree?
Yes.
And so San Rafael is going to be the second one?
Yep.
West Marin would be a great place to do that for all the same reasons.
I imagine all of the cities are.
Any other questions from the committee? Or any members of the public answers?
I see no hands at this time.
Any other committee points for discussion, or if not, we can move on to the consent calendar. Nope. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so minutes from May 27th, Community Oversight Committee. Any committee members wish to pull anything from the consent calendar?
No thanks.
I move that we approve the consent calendar.
Second.
And that is a motion from Director McCauley with a second from Vice Chair Wagner. And I will go ahead and proceed with the roll call, starting with Rebecca Suggs,
Yes.
Pat Randolph,
Yes.
Larry Minikis,
Yes.
John McCauley,
Yep.
Bruce Bartell,
Yes.
Jim Wagner,
Aye.
Jenny Biggs.
Yes.
Motion passes with unanimous support.
So I think we can move on to our action items. And we're starting with the compilation. Thank you so much, Jim. By the way, Thank you so much for chairing the last couple of meetings too.
You're
Thank you for filling in.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate that. I meant to say that from the very beginning. So we've got the compilation that you had prepared. Hopefully everybody had a chance to read through that, and we can open this up for questions from the committee.
So I would advise that we walk through it sequentially from top to bottom and do it by title. I have a lot of comments, right? So,
Okay.
Start with background, then do metrics, then just go through each section.
Okay. How about so first sections here, and by the way, we will need to add the letter from the board chair and letter from the committee chair, I think, but we've got the compilation of what this is right now.
Do I have this right? Are you the person that will provide the letter for this?
Yes, and also the board chair.
And I
They're
work with the
two,
board.
they're usually two.
I work with the board chair for that letter.
Okay.
Yeah, I wrote the last one.
So you write the committee chair letter and Hillard writes the board chair letter? Okay.
Correct. So hopefully no questions on this. Nobody's written anything yet. Let's get moving. The next, we've got the upfront matter that's just about the committee. Anyone have questions about that, or can we go straight to financial oversight?
Can I just focus people on the last box on that page 9? This was all just guessing on my part. Do I have everybody in the right zone and with the right title and with the correctly spelled names?
Okay, so this is the committee members during the 24-25 fiscal year at the bottom of the page. And I don't think we have page numbers on the document
We
yet,
don't.
but it's the second page if you're looking at the PDF.
Right. There are page numbers on the agenda packet if that's helpful.
You'll see that.
Those look accurate to me.
Okay.
Yeah, everybody okay with that?
Yep.
Okay, okay,
Yes, yes.
financial oversight.
I have a comment on the background, second paragraph.
Okay.
It says the COC will confirm that the financial data in this section is consistent with data in the financial statements by blah, 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 for the year ending June 30th, 24. So we need to amend this paragraph. I don't think we should write it now, but there's going to be a subcommittee when this is all done, I can anticipate. But the 24 year is not done. The 25 year is not done. Okay. So the 24-year audited financial statements have been issued at this point. They came out in March. Mark hasn't had a chance to complete his review yet. I think it's important for us to understand a decent timeline for that because we have several ways to go depending on how fast you can be done. So,
And I'm meeting with Brett from the auditor on Monday or Tuesday next week.
so once that's done, and I have to emphasize it has to be quick because if it's not quick, I think we owe the public something. And if we can't get the financial data resolved for the prior year, I don't see how we can conclude as an organization. So that would be a very bad path to go down. So I'm suggesting that since this thing was issued in March, a lot of time has elapsed and it's becoming critical to have that done quickly. It's becoming, okay. And then we need to put the words in because hopefully what the words will say is 24 is now completed and any differences will be laid out in the subsequent elements of the financial oversight. And you can choose to either do that with each difference as they go through them, or you could do that like at the end with a table. If they're all minor, I would suggest to say some sort of generic thing with a small table might be the easiest way to deal with that, but you have to see what you can, how it works out. And then we need to indicate that the 25 audit, it hasn't even started yet, right? So
No, it started.
okay, wow, okay. But we're commenting on the 25 year, so all that information, just like last year, will be subject to review, comparison to the audit report. There's no reason for us to delay issuing our statements.
The 25 should be presented to the board next month, correct? August?
I will be, no, I do not think it'll be ready by then.
Okay.
So we say that the 2025 audit is underway probably before trying to wrap this up, but not presented.
It started was it June 21st or something they started on it?
Okay.
So 9 days before 1 year anniversary of the completion of the year.
I'm taking notes on things that we might want to amend, but you may be doing that too, since you have the hard copy or the soft copy.
Okay.
But,
Yes.
okay.
And I have one. I'll go to the bottom of page 4. On remaining,
Whoa.
page 4, it starts out at the top.
This-
It's actually numbered. There's actually a number on it.
Yeah, so you jump way ahead because between now and then I've got other comments at the start
Oh,
with
okay,
metrics. So
sorry.
I think we
Do you
need to
want me
catch. Yeah, I think we need to.
Oh, sorry.
Let's
I
go
think we're coming-
sequentially. Yeah. Okay. So we've done background, and now we're starting metrics.
Okay.
Okay. And within metrics, the first comment I would like to make is one of joy, which will make Pat happy. The little dot, the third dot down is smaller than the other dot, so I do read this stuff. All right.
Well,
It is
we
smaller.
we will make sure.
Joanne will catch that one.
That the
I know.
dots are all the same.
I'm joking. All right.
We can even call them bullets if we like.
There you go.
Yes.
Okay.
Get technical.
Well, these are actually periods, I think he's talking about.
No, it's a bullet point.
Oh, is it a bullet point?
It's not a period,
Okay.
technically speaking. Though it looks like one. Completely.
Okay, 23 through 26. So, so in metrics, just as an FYI, after the first two bullets, the next line says that the 23,373, 865 of total expenditures. Just want to confirm that I tied that number to the financial report, so that number is proper. And then you've got your admin costs of 5.4%. Okay, then we.
So these are not changes.
These are not changes, I'm just saying we've got to check stuff to make sure it all fits. I mean, the problem is we don't have all the tables yet, and everything has to work together. You got a rollover, you got the current year expense, there's a whole bunch of stuff that all has to fit exactly together, so you really can't do a full review until everything is in front of you. Okay, the next comment I've got is towards the bottom of that page, where it says, see table 1 below. Annual expenditures more than disbursements reduce cumulative rollover. It should be noted that adjustments to the annual expenditures were made for fiscal 23-24 for Corte Madera and County of Marin, making up for previously unreported expenditures. I believe that when your reconciliation is done, we should have a sunshine around $2, $200,000, $2 million. So I think some numerics are probably warranted there. And that would be consistent with any time there's a difference. And like I said, you can either do them all in one place or you can do them as you go, whatever you think makes sense.
On that point, can I make another suggestion?
Yeah.
There are references in this document, see table 1 below, see attached, see attached. And the suggestion that I have is, if I understand it correctly, this first reference, see table 1 below, was my suggested change. I think that's inaccurate.
Well, and when we send it to Joanne, she'll organize and make sure that the reference to table 1 is actually right.
Okay, but she'll need to know which one is right. And so my suggestion would be, and let me see if this is right. For table 1, we're actually referencing, there will be 3 rollover tables, right? There'll be core, D-space, and what?
Combined.
Core, D-space, and local, right?
There's not a table for core. Core is within a document. Usually what you got is by city, you got a D-space and you've got a local. And what we did last year was we had a combined number, a D-space number, and a local number. I don't think you need the combined number
I don't think
personally.
so either.
I would just do D-space and local.
Okay. So then in this, where it says see table 1 below, that's going to be actually referencing the D-space table.
Correct.
Right?
Exactly.
Can we agree that the D-space rollover table will be table 2? Since your table at the bottom of the metrics is table 1?
Oh, the 80% thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
table 1 is the 80%. But this is referencing specifically the D-space.
That all makes sense. I think she can handle all that kind of stuff.
Do you think so?
She has before,
Yeah, we all work with her on this stuff. so-
because the,
Okay.
actually the 80% table, if you look at the flow of the document, would be table 3. Because the metrics talk about local D-space first, and then it talks about the 80%, so the D-space table would be 1,
Just needs to
local
get
would be
put in
2.
Okay,
I think
you don't
on
want your 80% table at the bottom of the metrics?
Okay, I think we're getting way too in the weeds on this.
Yeah.
Now,
Okay.
what frankly was gonna happen is that usually you have a break after the financial oversight section. At the end of the financial oversight section is the 80% thing, and then after that drops the D-space and
Okay.
local.
I'm happy to do it that way.
That's how we did it last year.
And I hand it to Joanne with a C table and just put X and highlight it, and she'll figure all of this out.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so the 80% discussion. Yeah, so now I'm on page 4. I think you're gonna come right after me, or maybe,
It's probably the same thing.
okay. My comment is in the middle of the page.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and what you got there is you say as part of the 5-year review, 80% of the revenues, blah, 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 should be allocated to the respective zones with a 5-year, in the 5-year period. Then the next paragraph says, okay, so we've got 22,041,041, that's the right number. That was the tax proceeds, and therefore 60% of that is 13,224,972. That's all good. And those numbers should agree to the table, which is the 80% rollover table, and I believe those numbers do agree. The next paragraph is kind of confusing, and I did prompt Mark, I was going to ask about this. So the target expenditures for vegetation management was 11,902. That number, once you can take it through.
So, yeah.
This whole paragraph, I think, can be deleted, isn't it?
And if you guys are happy with deleting it, I'm happy with deleting it. So we take the 13,224,972 is 60% of 22 million. Then we cannot exceed 10% of that 13,000 for administration costs. So what we do is we take 10%, sequester that for admin, and that remaining is 11,902,476. So that's what we tell the member agencies. This is what our 100% spend target is for core. But it could be getting a little bit too in the weeds.
Yeah, we're focused on actual expenditures. We're reporting to the taxpayers what's actually spent. We don't need to get into all this budget stuff.
Let's delete it.
Yeah, and that wasn't there previously, so I think we could just take that whole paragraph out.
I do like that we're talking about getting in the weeds on vegetation management.
Oh, good one.
Okay.
All right.
So the whole paragraph's gonna go.
Security.
The target expenditure for vegetation management
Yes.
paragraph is going to go.
Yes.
We're gonna pull it.
Okay, that's all I've got on that page. I think, Mary, you got something?
Okay, so go to the bottom there. The remaining, that should be 4,295,978.
Oh, right. Oh, I had that one too, yeah.
You have that? I
Yeah.
assume you caught it.
Oh.
Actually.
I forgot to say it though.
Yeah, no, I
Where-
assume you caught it because it's
Where
obvious.
are you?
At the
Yeah,
very bottom of
there's a missing
Oh,
a missing digit in there.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah, 95 became 7. It should be 4295. 4295.
Yeah.
4295, 970. Yeah. Okay, now we get to the actual famous 80% table. This looks different than what we had in the prior year, but it still works. But the first thing is we should not have a total column at the bottom of that section. So you get Central, Nevada, Santa Fe, Southern, West, and total. Since we're trying to do a test to see whether somebody's met 80%, you don't get to offset somebody who's over or somebody who's under, because you can be over 80. There's no problem with being over 80, right? It's only the unders that we're focused on. So that footing at the bottom is confusing. I would eliminate that footing.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
And
Very
then
important.
I can tell you
In
that
the middle here.
the rollovers do not tie to the prior year rollovers, and that will be something that Mark will address with us. But they're not dramatically different, but virtually every one of them's got different numbers. Yeah, it was before. It was there before. But one other thing I forgot, sorry, on the prior page, I got all excited to make sure Larry's comment goes in there. When we kill that one paragraph, let me see. There's a comment somewhere in this section. Where is it? Oh, yeah, here it is, yeah. So there's some commentary here about external grants, and we're deleting it now because this whole paragraph is gone. But at the big picture, when you do your reconciliation between the audited financial statements and our report, there should be differences automatically because the financial statements contain grants. Both grants received and grants expenditures made and grants yet to be spent, which is really a good thing. Right? So when doing the reconciliation between the audited financial statements and this report, I think there should be a sentence somewhere that says that our CSC report is focused on tax revenues and not on other activities, but note that NWPA was successful in generating grants of whatever the number is for which that was spent and this much is left. Just, it's good news. So, but I would exclude any grant numbers and expenditures from any of our numbers because we're not focused on that. The only place it falls in is with regards to the 10% test. It does fall in that number, and I don't think you have to get into that. That's why that number. I know why that number is different, and I'm happy with it. But that seems like it's a little too weedy there. Does that make sense?
So you're suggesting that we keep some mention of the grants in this metric statement?
If I was Mark, I would say this metric statement is inclusive of all the uses of the tax revenues. And separate from that, NWPA has also successfully generated grants of X dollars, which this much was spent and this much remains to be spent. And those balances are excluded from the COC report. Because we're not auditing NWPA, we're not commenting on everything that happens with NWPA. We're only talking about what happens with the tax revenues. You all good with that?
That'll be easy.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good.
As long as Mark is good at that.
It'll be easy.
There's a question. Where it says work plan oversight right below that, it says the analysis is based on review of the 23-24. Don't we mean the 24-25? Yeah.
That's the next one I've got. Exactly. Okay. But you can do it for that's good. Okay. Next comment I've got is with regards to core projects under overview. So same page at the bottom. It says that we looked at the thing in great detail, and it was well constructed, and it showed great prior planning and excellent preparation. That seems like we're being a little exactly cheering on. I would get rid of all those descriptors. I would just make it just clean, right? So we looked at it in detail. That's it. We didn't look at it in great detail. We just looked at it in detail, and the work plan was well constructed, and that'd be it. And I think those extra words I would stylistically remove. It's not a big deal. That would be my suggestion. So that's all I got there. So now we move on to page 2.
We're in supplement to funding of the Marin Space Alliance.
Yeah, well, it titles Central Marin Supplemental. Exactly.
And there are page numbers now.
Right, exactly. So R1. So this was the fact that Central Marin as a zone, this is you found this, Central Marin as a zone was spending money on D-Space activities, in addition to the D-Space stuff that's allocated separately, right? And we're saying, what's going on here? I'm confused about this because we will have I can't answer it right now, but we will have a rollover schedule soon for every entity which is in Central Marin, right? And if we have entities in Central Marin for which there is money available, turn this off. I did turn this on. Yay, football. Do not disturb. Yeah. Oh, it's my son called. If he calls twice, he gets through. Okay, back to my super good train of thought. If the Central Marin entities all spent 100% of their allocated revenues, and then there was more spent, that's one story. If they have rollover because they haven't spent everything, but then they've also spent this money out of core, that doesn't make any sense, right? So we've already said, somebody, a committee or executive committee should figure out what's going on here. But I think the sentence, we need something to make some clarification that core funds were shifted to defensible space and homeland by the Central Marin Zone. I would hope there'd be a sentence after that that would say that Central Marin, whoever that is, that's more, how many entities are in Central?
About 9 or 10.
Okay, that group collectively has either underspent or is on budget or overspent. Just a sentence that describes where they are with their 20% allocation numbers.
That's for you guys. This is your portion of the report.
Okay, so we can't do it until we get over
Right.
all of it. Okay, but as long as someone tells me who's in Central Marin, I can add them all up and add a sentence. So I just think we should add a sentence.
Makes sense to me.
Okay, good.
And I have one wordsmithing.
Mhm.
We're using spent a lot, like Central Marin supplemental to funding of the Marin Defensive Space Alliance. We'd say 100% was spent. Wouldn't that really be 100% was dispersed? Be the correct language? And I'm asking. You spend money, but it also gets dispersed out. 100% got dispersed. Doesn't mean that it was actually spent. It means there's a difference between spent and dispersed. That's all I'm saying.
Where are you?
Right here. Let's say, let's start here. We go 100% was spent.
Got it.
And
Well-
below we talk about how money was spent. San Rafael spent this much. SMFD spent this much. That's a little bit different. That's all.
Well, I agree with you, and in fact, it's kind of confusing because I know what that means. I mean, all the,
Yeah, you got to be that. Yeah.
well, core projects, you may not, that's money that is controlled within NWPA and not, because NWPA basically takes the 220s and it goes right out the door, right? So I agree that was kind of confusing. But that goes to the idea that with this reconciliation that they had fully spent the money. That's what I'm confused about. So I guess when we figure out the sentence, we could pull those two together.
Yeah.
Okay, I agree with that.
Okay, so we'll flag that there's a sentence coming here.
The definition of Central Marin is different depending on where you look. I Googled it once and there were like 3 cities in it. When you look up centralmarin.gov or org or something like that.
So
So
for the purposes of Marin Wildfire, starting from the east, working west, you have Clarksburg, Corte Madera, Kentfield, Ross, San Anselmo, Sleepy Hollow, Fairfax, and County of Marin.
Okay, so you have your own definition, so that's fine. So that's the definition we'll use when we figure out, when you give us the table for expenditures for DSA, we'll figure out.
And
Each of those
that's the description that's in all
All the
other
all of our
documents.
documents.
And to be fair, it's not Mark's description, it's Marin Wildfire's description.
Yeah.
It's on the record.
The hitch in the giddy up though is that Marin County Fire throws a kink in everything because they have pockets of jurisdiction in all 5 zones.
okay.
So so the comments with regards to core money that is being spent in Central Marin, is that exclusive or inclusive of Marin County?
Inclusive.
Inclusive. So does Marin County tell us how much money they've spent in the Central Marin cities?
When it comes to the local and D space, it depends on what type of project they're working on, but yeah. Like for the D space, they know how much they've spent in D space in the Ross Valley zone versus or Central Marin zone, sorry, versus the San Rafael zone, because CSA 13 and CSA 19 are Marin County Fire's responsibility to inspect. So they know how much they've spent there, they know how much they've spent in the inspections in the other zones, so.
Not to mention it's at December 31st, but let's skip that for now. So, okay, if it's okay with the committee, I'll work with Mark to make sure that sentence makes sense. Is that all right?
Will we be able to tell by looking at the rollover tables this calculation that for the sentence that we want to add?
I would, John and I can discuss what type of, you would have to look at the county fire rollover number with a different lens than the other ones.
You either make it really simple, or if you're gonna do county separately, it'll be an extra piece of the sentence that describes
Yeah.
how it's done. So it can be easily worked out.
Okay.
Okay. So next comment I've got is on R2. So this confuses me. So we have an observation, right? And the observation says that after extensive conversations with the executive officer, the COC is convinced that all positions are working appropriately on wildfire preparation. And then it says, as a recommendation, in future years, sponsoring agencies should be required to report time spent on MWPA related activities. So I'm a little unclear about what happened here. I'm guessing that what happened is that they did not provide such a report, and that through inquiry that we made, we became convinced.
So each year, I for agencies that have positions, I say how much of their time is spent. They don't give me a number of hours, they give me a percentage. So I do get that breakdown every year. And then with the spreadsheets that we ask them to fill out for anything that is positioned, they put a percentage in that spreadsheet. So we have 2 data points that are saying what their percentage of time is wildfire related.
So why do we need a recommendation to do what they've always done? That's what my question is. And so whose section is this? This is your section. So if you looked at it and you became convinced everything was okay, but there was existing evidence on that, then we don't need to have a comment to say provide existing evidence again in the future, because it happens all the time. So I don't understand. When I read this, I was confused. Why do we have a recommendation? It's either it didn't exist and then we bugged management and they provided us with additional data, which means we created a control, which is a no-no, right? Or it was there all along and we don't need a recommendation. I'm not fighting for one or the other. I just want to know what's the proper way to look at this.
Exactly what are we talking about?
R2, recommendation 2.
Well, I don't have my things done quite the way you do.
So multiple positions were funded by Marin Wildfire, which required the executive officer to carefully monitor positions and receive reports. You beat him up and you said it's okay. Recommendation, in future years, if similar positions are proposed and created, the sponsoring agencies should be required to report time spent on MWPA-related activities to the executive officer to assure proper use of resources. And my point is, if they're already doing it, we don't have to tell them to do it because they're already doing it.
I don't remember how this
My
got there, so.
My recollection was when we discussed this was that, and I may not be remembering this correctly, but my understanding was that you had to do a whole lot of door knocking to get numbers.
In previous years, now it's automatic.
Now, when did now start?
About 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, so then I'm confused as well.
Then we need to take it out.
Is this an old observation that was a legacy of a prior report?
Yeah, that's a resolved matter, and
Yeah.
this year's audit was, this year's COC review was successful, but you used the words after extensive conversation, so that made me like a little
Were those prior years, maybe?
this is this year's report.
I don't know if it was that.
You take it out. I don't, or I will go home and read it more tonight because I don't have it quite sitting right in front of me.
Yeah, who else was with you? Scott was with you, right?
Scott was working with me and Larry was working with me.
Okay, well, I'm not arguing for,
Okay.
I don't have a point of view like it should be either this or
Yeah.
that. I'm just reading it cold and saying, in my brain of logic, it's either one or the other. Either we had it made, as a result of our extensive work, additional information was created, and therefore we should say, be better in the future, or alternatively, no, the information was all there, and we shouldn't say, keep doing what you were doing. So, which would argue for removal. So either one's fine. So
Yeah, I'm fine either way. I mean, you can take it out.
The other option is just to add it to observations and just confirm this is how it's being done.
So we don't have, I think our observations also all have recommendations, isn't that how we decided this was gonna work? I was never a big fan of this, but I think that's how it works, right? I mean, you could slide it up under budget positions in several jurisdictions and add it there. So I would suggest that we just let Pat think about it and
Okay.
put it where you want it. I don't,
Or just
or get rid of it, one or the
get
other.
rid of it, yeah.
All those are all good as far as I'm
Right.
concerned.
And that is in the core section?
Yeah, budgeted positions in several jurisdictions.
Core projects are two,
Okay,
recommendation two.
okay, I can picture where it is in there. Now we'll take a look at it tomorrow and see.
Okay. Okay. So I have nothing on page 3. Does anybody have anything on page 3?
This is genders are a little confusing, but this is the just after Nevada's fire adaptive multimedia campaign.
Voluntary abatement
And the
program,
voluntary
Southern Marin,
abatement
et cetera, fire safe funding.
They're doing the fire safe Marin funding.
So I do have a recommendation because we have, we talk about fire safe Marin and we have an observation number 5. It says maybe we should just bring it under our wing. And then we have another recommendation, number 3, that says that money was spent outside of fire safe Marin. What's that all about, right? So I would think that you'd want to take observation 5 and put it before observation 3. Isn't that, we tell the fire safe Marin story first, and then we add an additional comment afterwards. Just an ordering thing. So I think that order is better that way. You guys get what I'm talking about?
Just move the whole section, is what you're saying.
I just said it's just a slight movement of the order of things.
Yeah.
Right.
That's-
Move fire safe marine funding prior to Nevada's fire adaptive multimedia
Yeah,
campaign,
exactly.
and have it be those two coupled
Together.
side by
Exactly.
side.
Exactly. Exactly.
Or
I
top,
think it just flows a lot better.
And fire safe marine is our parent media campaign, and Nevada Fire is kind of a sub campaign, so having fire safe marine come first, followed by.
Right.
That makes sense.
Because we have 2 questions. First one is fire safe Marin. Why is it separate? It should be part of this. And then second question is, well, if we've already got fire safe Marin, why is Nevada also spending something beyond that? Does that make sense? Those are what your findings. So I think that's a good, better logical order for doing the findings.
Local projects?
Okay.
Got that fox tune stuck in my head.
Football theme song.
Yeah, so I don't have any comments in this whole section except for one. And that is under observations.
So if in the
Before
overview, there's that highlighted comment that we should probably decide about.
Yeah, I don't know if we, did this end, I flagged that because at the time we were talking about that was gonna be in D space, perhaps. But if it didn't make it into D space, we can just leave this paragraph.
Sorry, what are you guys talking about? What page?
At the bottom of the overview section,
What
right
page?
before 4.
It's the PDF, page 8, but it looks like it's page 4.
That highlighted may wish to note.
We're in local. It's the only thing that's highlighted in
Yeah.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
it's this.
Okay.
May wish to note.
I do have a comment there.
Okay. So, I think it's good to kind of say things once and not make it duplicative. I've got
Yes.
another comment later about that, not to get ahead
So,
of it.
and this was in here originally because they hadn't yet been compiled.
Hmm?
So if this comes up in D space, we can delete this whole paragraph. Or cross-reference, or if it didn't come up in D space.
It didn't come up in D-space. We didn't have a comment on that. Because there was no D-space before, so.
Okay.
You know, the idea of high-level service has never been a D-space issue because it just wasn't happening before the MWPA was created. So there is nothing in D-Space on that topic.
Okay, so then we can just delete that highlighted
Just the parenthetical.
Yeah.
Okay.
on out of bracket.
Can I point out something more that I could catch with that?
Yes.
Is that there's 4 instances I did a search of D dash space, and everywhere else we're capital D, capital S, D space, one word.
Yeah, good point.
So just for consistency, there's like 3 others where we use either capital D space.
Well, we also spell out defensible space.
And we also
should
spell it
just
out.
pick one and
Yeah,
use it,
and
but
pick
yeah,
one,
but
exactly.
I think
Let's
the
ask Joanne.
abbreviation D and then capital.
Yeah.
I mean, capital G and space if we're using the abbreviated version.
we can
So-
just ask Joanne to be consistent.
That's all.
Okay, so you get to the end there of that section, and you said, observations overall, everything's great. And then we have a paragraph, total community rollover as a 685 for local was reported this and that. That whole section has nothing to do with, we are in, what section? We're in local now, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we're in local. So
We can remove that.
Yeah.
I think I added that because at one point in a meeting, somebody said we needed to add it.
I think we should get rid of it because
Good.
it's duplicative. I would just,
Yeah.
I would just
Let's
get
get rid of it.
I need to read my PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm not even, I don't even see which page it's on right now. Do you know where we are, Jim?
nope, I
Okay.
do not.
page 7.
Page 7. 7, oh,
It's page 7 on the, not the PDF, but
got it. So we're after all the long lists.
yes, exactly. Under observations, the second paragraph.
Just get rid of total accumulated
Right.
paragraph.
Because those aren't precise numbers, you already have it ahead. So-
Yeah, I think in a meeting like 4 months ago, somebody said we needed to add that, so I dutifully added it, but I didn't understand why we were sticking it there in the first place. I'm happy to remove it.
Okay.
Out. I'm all for brevity.
We just wanted to make sure that you guys knew that we had done the math.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Rebecca and I were having fun with our calculators.
Okay, now we have a series of recommendations. And this gets really kind of messy because it's, it's from the 23 report, the 24 report, the 25 report, and all that kind of stuff. If you look at what we did last year, which of course is ancient history now, it was a nice graphical thing that gave you the stories, and at the bottom it had a box that basically said it's resolved or further follow-up is necessary. And it was in its own little box that kind of made you jump out at it. I believe in this section, with the exception of the conversation about the dam rangers, the rest of them I think have all been closed, if I understand that right?
Not 8.
What one is 8?
9, 10.
8 is the,
Oh, yeah, right.
it's the updating of the board of specific projects that are in local and D space. Status of the unfinished projects.
That's not 8.
Follow-up from 23-24, recommendation 8, COC recommends the board conduct an annual review of each member agency's expenditure activity level, compliance of individual expenditures. That one?
Oh, yeah, okay, that's right. That's the one where we have a further dialogue about it in our section.
Yes,
So I think we should, in this section, just because we consider that not done,
correct.
we consider that open. So I think back here, we should say, see further comment under the D-space section.
Okay, so in the local section, the recommendation, when we have the follow-up, when we come to,
Actually, an easier, better way to do it, how about this, sorry to interrupt you. Why don't we just say recommendation 8, just kill all that dialogue and say it's duplicative of what is in the D-Space session, see the comment there. So instead of doing it twice,
So
just do it
just
once.
recommendation 8, just say CD space,
Yes,
recommendation,
same number. It's for the prior year. too.
okay, CD space, so that would be lovely.
Got it. That makes
So,
sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
1, 2, 3 paragraphs gone.
Okay. Okay, so the next thing I've got is the Ranger thing.
The Ranger thing.
The
Ever
internal
never get
ranger thing.
All right. I should stand for this part. Okay, so Mark kindly showed me where to find it, and I went back to the board discussion of February, and it was a consent item. And the consent item had reports from San Rafael and Nevada, which were identical except for the numbers.
Do you guys know what we're talking about?
Oh, yes.
We do, yes.
Okay.
And it was pulled off of consent. Kohler pulled it off of consent, like her, and there was some dialogue. The dialogue basically focused. Should I just summarize this real quick?
Yeah,
What they did was they discussed how much cost should be included. So you have the actual ranger, and both of the two cities said, well, in addition to the ranger, we're absorbing other costs because we're supervising that. So it's kind of like full allocated cost accounting, so should we get, 1% from the city manager, that kind of thing? Or are we just looking at the core activity of the ranger themselves? They stated that while they're recovering all the ranger costs, that represents roughly 85% of their total expenditures because they have management over the ranger. And that's what their conversation was about. But that was not what our inquiry was about, okay? So our inquiry was different. And I believe that we as a COC could bring matters to the board and say, you should look into this. But once the board has decided on something, I think they've decided and it's done. However, we still have the right, this is the Lucy right, we still have the right to comment on their conclusion as to how we feel about it, okay? So let me tell you how I feel about it and see how you guys feel about it, okay?
we know how you feel about it.
Well, let's use some common sense, okay? So when you have contact with the indigent, the homeless, it's a very sad thing, but there's 4 possible things that can happen, right? You can reach out to that person and provide them with social services. You can say, hey, let me help you get off drugs, or let me, get you someplace better, all that stuff. Very important stuff, and the cities are doing a good job there. All these things are all great, by the way. I'm totally supportive of the program. I just don't think that MWPA should be paying for all of it. Okay, so that's the first thing you can do. The second thing you can do is you can do core police work. And these are sworn officers with weapons, as I recall, right? We've gone through the whole program. They can go and say, hey, your roommate that I've noticed you've been hanging around with, because they know these people. I've gone out on patrols in my town, which is not charging anything for this, and they show the new council members around. So the dog and pony shop. They know all these people. They know where they live, as it were. They check in with these people. It's important. It's good, right? But those are police activities, right? Hey, there's a bunch of bikes over there that weren't there 2 days ago. Hey, the person you're hanging around with has got a black eye. What's going on here? Let's pursue it. So that's another valuable thing that they do. A third valuable thing they do is they say, hey, you've got a portable heater and you've got it leaning against the side of your plastic tent that you're living in. That's probably not the best idea in the world, right? That is fire adjacent. And what I mean by that is fire departments put out fires. That's what the job is. By the way, mainly medical, but that's another thing. So fire departments put out fires.
And prevent them.
And prevent them, exactly. And they do inspections and all that kind of stuff. Certainly when you do a remodel, you get lots of inspections. To me, that effort is, if it were more of a fire type effort, okay? Then the last thing that they do is they do community protection activities. That's our role. Okay? So if they find a homeless person in high grass during a red flag week and they said, you got to get the hell out of here, that's something that is in our world. Okay? But All the rest of that stuff is not part of our mission.
I think number 3 is.
No, number 3 is general fire activity. That's a fire department. We don't, MWPA is not building firehouses, is not paying firemen salaries. That's why I see a distinction between that and, which is just general commentary. In their dialogue, one of the two cities said, when we contact a homeless person in downtown San Rafael, we are helping prevent fires. And now, if that homeless person is in downtown San Rafael, I don't think they're gonna burn the whole city down. Okay, so of the 4 activities, there's one that is clearly totally in our wheelhouse. And Larry's mentioned this previously. You have a bunch of grass up above you, and there are people living up in there, and that's bad, right? However, if it's February and you're in the middle of a what do you call it?
Atmosphere.
Atmosphere river. Yeah, AR is raining for like 3.5 months, 2 months, which supposedly going to happen next year. Not going to that's, you're not going to create a conflagration. You're not going to burn the whole community down, and that's what the voters did here. They said, protect the broader community, right? Do the 10-foot rule, do this and that and the other thing. So the concept that 85% of their activities are something that we pay for, to me as a taxpayer, I'm offended by that. I think that I've seen how cities' budgets work. They're very tight across all elements of budget. Ooh, there's a box we can grab some money, let's do that. And you get two largest cities in our group saying it, and the rest of the 17 members or whatever they are on the board are going, okay, right? So this to me is not good governance. So here is what my suggestion would be. Okay, I would say, okay, for discussion, I propose the following conclusion. COC now considers this recommendation closed as the board has reached a definitive conclusion. The board accepted that all ranger homeless interactions are ignition reduction work. That's the words they used, ignition reduction work. They never defined what that meant, right? Okay. As voters, COC continues to find it hard to accept an 85% allocation of these rangers' costs to MWPA, given the significant policing efforts involved in interactions with the homeless and the reality that a conflagration is unlikely during months with substantial rain. So you guys have decided, okay, I'm going to go out and try and get this thing passed again in 5 years. But if I was on the other side of it, I could certainly point at this as not being the best use of our $20 million a year. So they've made a decision. I think we should close the door on it, but I don't think we should just go out and say, oh, it's fine. I think we should say, board, you had a chance to make this decision. You made your decision. It's done. We don't think that was the right decision. And we have the right to do it. Right?
And whatever we say, we need to say as a committee.
Of course,
So I'm
we have to
interested
agree.
hear,
Yeah, we have to agree.
other-
So one way to approach this is suggest a fixed amount, 25, 35, 40%.
I think the board's decided that they're
Yeah.
done. I think John's wanting to sort of on the record express dissatisfaction with the decision, but the decision's made.
So we don't want to suggest what we think is reasonable.
I don't think there's a revision.
No,
think
correct.
there's-
Right. We discussed in an earlier date,
Okay.
how much should it be? Should it be
Right.
50? Should it be 20? How should you come about it?
And the
And
decision's
what we
been
said
made.
collectively was that that's
So-
not our job. We're not management. We're
So
not
I-
Right.
oversight.
Yeah, so I
Exactly.
think the key part is COC now considers this matter closed, and then if there's another paragraph to express dissatisfaction that the committee feels is important, that's where we put that in, but I think we wanna be, I don't,
We want
we
to
need to
recommend
see if
that
that's
they
a joint feeling or
that they
not.
relook at this again at a later date.
No, we're not saying anything about that.
No.
We're just saying you made your decision. We're moving on, and they were anxious to have us move on, right? It's moved on, but we think that was
We don't agree with
we don't agree.
decision.
That was not a
The question
red
is,
card.
how wordy do we need to be then? I mean, there are other places where we just have disagree. Last year, we just put disagree. I don't know.
I think it's pretty. I think we have to say why. And let me read it again because it's only not that long.
Yeah.
So let me read it to you again.
Oh, sorry, John, just one more comment about that, but I think somewhere we ought to say this is about wildfire, not just fire. The homeless being downtown may not have a lot to do with wildfire.
Okay, I use the word conflagration, so you suggested add the word wildfire?
I'm just saying it's MWPA, not,
Yeah, it's exactly. It's not NFPA.
that's right.
Right, that's your comment, like, we're not paying for firemen and fire stations.
Well, they're
Disagree, it
also
depends
in,
on where it's happening.
Yeah,
I know Tom's
the
work
conditions.
happens out in the field, in the wildlands of Hamilton.
Mhm.
He doesn't work in downtown, and the San Rafael Rangers don't work in downtown San Rafael.
well, the San Rafael Rangers work on San Rafael Hill above downtown.
And that may be fine. And so maybe you don't need to even say anything there.
Well, let me just read it again and we can digest it.
Larry, you can tell more than anybody.
I've never seen a ranger up there.
You've never seen a ranger. And Larry lives on the part of San Rafael Hill where there have been fires and.
But let me say something now.
Yeah.
It's the Elk Club side, it's the side facing
Okay.
Mission Avenue where the homeless are really gathering. So I wouldn't necessarily see a ranger, but I don't see a ranger truck going up our street or, I'm just not.
So I tried
In all
to
fairness.
keep this as, I didn't want to go through my little diatribe about social work and police work and general fire stuff and community wildfires. I tried to be
Right,
I wanted to talk to you guys about why, because on the surface you think this is good work, but now wait a minute.
well, that's
So
why
let me
I
read
guess
it.
I'm pushing for brevity because I think it's easier to agree with fewer, the chances of coming to agreement are on fewer words rather than lots of specificity. And we can do that if that's what people really want to push for, but then we have to make sure everybody's on the page for lots and lots of words. And it's a closed issue. So I get that you want to like have this on the record, but if we can do it in a way where we can move through it and people feel.
Okay, let's go through it sentence by sentence.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm sorry, I always slow things down, but is this issue closed? Because the board didn't address what our concerns were. We don't care about 85-15, we don't care about 50-50, that's their decision, they made the decision, we're happy about that. But the issue of the scope of the role of the ranger was not discussed in the board, as I understand it.
That is true.
So is the issue closed?
I think that you gotta come to a point, we've asked about this for 3 years running. I think politically, there's gotta be a point where you just say, we're gonna go away. So we can entertain the idea whether we wanna push back further and say, no, board, you didn't even answer the right question. But I don't think that's a good idea, personally.
I personally don't think that it's going to do any good to,
Ask them to do any more?
yeah, to say, do your job, but,
We've got within our community plenty of recent activity that shows that when you have a large group of people and they have their heads down and they don't do a good job, it doesn't create a good outcome for the voter, right? So, and here's a circumstance where I think it has been less than a sterling result. And I think I've said, okay, we're done. By the way, you didn't do a great job. So I'll read it to you again.
Sorry, Mark, why was this issue on the agenda for the board in
Because
February?
We raised it because we raised it.
Because we raised it.
Yes.
Mark, the question I want to
Part of the committee
ask,
raised it.
pardon?
Part of the committee raised it, yeah.
The committee.
Do you feel like
We raised it as a committee. Okay?
we raised the issue that you were raising as a committee? Mark, do you feel that the question was presented clearly to the board?
Well, there were 2 meetings about it. The first meeting talked about the details of how and what they do. The second meeting talked about the numbers. So when you put those 2 meetings together, I would say the issues have been discussed.
Okay.
Yeah, they did. One year they said, let's just have this little meeting. And I was at the meeting, I think, and which I don't usually go to. And it was all hugs.
You made a joke.
Well, I wasn't a joke. But it wasn't funny, but yeah, but they never dealt with the dollars, right? Okay. COC now considers this recommendation closed as the board has reached a definitive conclusion. Any problem with that? Okay. The board accepted that all ranger homeless interactions are ignition reduction work. That's literally what they said. That's my second sentence. Okay. Third sentence. As voters, COC continues to find it hard to accept an 85% allocation of these rangers' cost to MWPA, one, given the significant policing efforts involved in interactions with the homeless and the reality that a wildfire configuration is unlikely during months with substantial rent. So we're keeping that at a pretty high level, right? You know, you're obviously doing some police stuff, and it's raining in the winter, so you're making us pay for most of this.
When I went over the work with the Vagos Ranger, the thing that I never got from them was the degree that it was audited. Tom fills out a timesheet and it describes what he does and he submits it to a supervisor. But I don't know if that information ever gets fed back, if it gets analyzed as far as what type of work they're doing. Maybe that needs to be in the system somehow. I don't know.
So in the first presentation, they did show the logs that he uses, that documents the contacts, what the contact was. And then it's also reviewed by Nevada Fire. They've actually said, wait a minute, they've caught a couple times where a training event got slipped in on accident, it wasn't on purpose. So there is checks and balances between Nevada Fire and Nevada PD on that. I've seen the documentation, I'm happy to share it with you.
And all that's
Is it
about,
still, things change.
and all that is about is just the fact that they're not actually charging NWPA for everything this person does. They're only charging for 90% of what they do. That's what that is about. Right? Because that guy brought that up with me when I was chair that one time when I said, let me clarify this. Or is this correct in what you're doing? So look, they're grabbing this money is what they're doing, to be blunt about it. I mean, you know, it's good work. It's general fund work. It's good work, it's general fund work, it's fire work, it's police work.
How many dollars are we talking about, actually?
100, let's see, it was 600, 700,000. Something
Between
like
the
that.
two programs,
Yeah.
5 to 6 probably.
Yeah, so it's substantial.
It's not nothing.
Yeah,
And by the way, the other cities are always doing this. This has been going on forever,
you know,
right?
Yeah,
And no one else is asking for the money. And all of a sudden you're going to see MV Mobile's going to say, "Oh, gee, I can take
Right.
20% of an officer because
right.
and everyone's sucking that money out." Right?
But this is new and therefore it can be covered by MWPA.
Well, it was new in
They've been
San
doing it.
Rafael, and at least Nevada's program is much newer.
So far, people haven't requested it. But is everybody comfortable with the language that John's proposing? I mean, I think
Can I just make, it's your language, but I be devil's advocate.
Sure.
This is a conversation John and I have had multiple times. But I think you open yourself up for a little bit of criticism of the comments that you make by having the temporal piece in there talking about winter and rain. Because wildfire prevention and education should be happening year round. Using your analogy, someone could say, well, then we should stop our defensible space evaluations in the rain. We should stop chipper day in the rain. We should stop public education in the rain because they're not on high fire danger days.
But those activities protect the community collectively.
Correct.
We're talking
So-
about individual.
So
people.
removal of an open burning device in February is a device that won't be there in July.
what if we say the same thing without talking about the rain?
Okay.
Rain months, winter months, whatever, just
I'm just,
make your.
I'm offering a suggestion, not because I disagree with what you're saying, I'm
Right,
offering a
right.
suggestion because I think you're opening yourself up
All right.
for some criticism.
So, okay, let's try it this way.
Or opening ourselves up to fate on a very dry and windy winter year. Let's not do that either.
Okay, so if we removed the fact that when it's pouring rain, because part of that, I understand what you're saying, I'm struggling with
Yeah.
the issue because are we really doing education? Do you think that, for this indigent person that we tell them something in February, they're going to react have them do different stuff in the summer. I mean, the good news would be if their social policies are effective, they won't even be there anymore, but
Yeah.
that's not what happens.
Well, I'm thinking specifically of the example of the hardware that's removed.
And also when encampments are moved out of high fire risk areas, if the patrolling isn't happening in the wintertime, they go right back to that spot in the winter, and then they have to get removed again in the summer.
I think if we just take the season out.
Okay, let's try it again. I mean, okay, first sentence we agreed with.
Yeah, second one we did too.
Yep. As voters, COC continues to find it hard to accept an 85% allocation of these ranger costs to NWPA, given the significant policing efforts involving the interactions with the homeless. And just stop there. You could say police and social. I mean, what's, because does the Rangers, do they do some social, stuff?
Yeah.
I mean, these are heartless people that get to know these people. I'm sure they're doing.
No, they are.
Yeah, what's the proper term for that?
That's a good question. I know there's a
Should I
proper
ask
term, but
Claude?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because I mean, there is.
behavioral health, social behavior, that's not it. Mental health.
Yeah, there's lots of, I mean, doesn't Centerville have like a group that goes out and reaches out to all these people, right? I mean, there's doing a lot of good work happening there, so.
They have
They
a
used to have
full
a-
ambulance.
Co-response model of homeless outreach.
They used to have he was a PhD psychologist that they had hired years ago to go into, handle the homeless. And he was an officer at the same time, so he's a psychologist and an officer.
How about
He was
this?
great, but we lost him.
All right.
What was that about?
You can laugh when I do it. Okay. As voters, COC continues to find it hard to accept the 85% allocation of these ranger costs to NWPA, given the significant policing and other efforts involved in interactions with the homeless. I said police and other. That's not bad.
That's fine.
That's fine, yeah.
Let's do it.
Effort's the right word.
And other non-wildfire?
What's a wildfire effort? I just think we're going down the.
Well, that's the crux of the issue. Anyway, I'm fine with that.
All right, Doug?
Anyone have any objections about it?
Okay.
All right, we've got a few more pages to go here, everybody.
The other question.
You'll send me that wording?
Sure. The other question that you asked earlier about is it worth even doing this? I think yes, because I think we need to let people know that we're continuing to look at efficient use of other funds,
Right, exactly.
even though it's been watched. We're still keeping an eye on things.
Right, exactly. And we have a right to disagree with the board if we think they completely muff something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So,
Okay. I mean, it was a consent item, right? The two largest cities in this group hand something and it comes up on a consent item and it says, hey, we don't charge you for our overhead. So everything's great. I mean, I thought, oh, you gotta be kidding me, so, all right.
But you know as well as I do, sometimes things are on consent, so it can be pulled, which makes a statement.
Okay, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know the backstory. But I was glad that Kohler raised it.
okay, D-space projects?
Let me see if I've got anything else. I hope not. Let's see, where am I? Page 8. Oh yeah, page 9. Okay, this is a significant comment. I need the typeset, it's a different size. So, anyway, that's a joke. Okay. Page 11 and throughout the document, no pennies. Right? We have pennies a few places.
Oh.
Yeah,
I think
including tables.
And in tables, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I would frankly bring everything to the K. I make everything up to 1,000 all the way through the document, but I don't care. Do whatever you want. I don't care, but don't have
We
tables.
could ask Joanne to make that consistent too.
Right.
That's a good idea.
Okay, so page 12 and 13. Oh yeah, so tables 2 and 3. So we have 3 tables in our section. Table 1 does not agree. It's 1.3 million versus 1.7 million. We said this is not even close, right? This is for all the DSA members exclusive of Santa Fe, Marin, and Nevada. Tables 2 and 3, just a reminder that when we get our final documents, we have to see whether they agree to the tables. That's all, it's just a step. There needs to be internal consistency. Jim and I worked diligently last year to make sure everything fit together. So we don't want it to just kind of be obviously on its surface sloppy. So, okay, and then when we have our recommendations in our section, we should follow the prior numbers. R5, R6, R7, right? Our numbers are 1, 2, 3. So we just need to continue with that. It's no big deal.
And that's the thing that we can ask Joanne to add.
Exactly. Yeah, okay, page 14. Yeah, so page 14, we have our,
Begin with record keeping
Yeah,
system.
sorry, which heading is this?
yeah, yes.
Record
Yes.
keeping system heading.
Yeah.
Yeah, record keeping systems, okay. Hold on, I gotta find that. Yeah, okay. So if you start at the bottom of the page, the COC reviewed the 14 members of DSA, identified some of these larger costs. For example, Novelli has an employee full-time DSpace inspector, in addition to the fact that there's a group that's out there, right? And there's also a community prevention coordinator there. And then we continue on, we have observations and ours are numbered. And at the end of our numbers, we have another section called follow up on prior year stuff, and it has recommendation number 8 there. That's at the very end of our document. So we think that that is okay. We should say this remains open, and we will remove the discussion of 8 in the prior section. And it'll only be there once. So I think that works, okay?
So no wording change here, it just says require COC follow-up, and leave that there, or no?
That requires COC follow-up was,
At the bottom of recommendation 8?
I think that was a prior report. So right below requires COC follow-up is the current year update. I think John is suggesting that we again say requires COC follow-up.
Exactly.
Okay.
We'll use the same pattern as we did last year, which was good, you know, a box, because you keep track. I mean, there was no comments in the prior year, there were comments 2 years back.
Right.
So then there was a response, and so it got really long, and now we're in year 4, right? So I think that works.
When you have a moment, I want to go back to observation 1 for a second.
Sure.
The very first sentence.
Yeah.
JPS sections 12C and 12C.
Whoops.
Yeah, there you go. You got it.
I don't know what
Yeah.
Jim wrote down. Is it 12C and 12D, or what is that?
I'm sorry.
Right there, 12C and 12C twice.
Observation 1.
Yeah, under observation 1. You probably meant 12B.
Or whatever.
Or should we work right there? Versus JPA section 12C and 12C.
Well, 12C I thought was very important.
Yeah, apparently.
I'll check it out.
You want to make sure we definitely saw 12C. There's something else I caught is that we're calling Mark sometimes executive director instead of executive officer. There's a few places where that showed up.
Another one we can ask Joanne to make sure it's consistent.
Which would you prefer? You
My
prefer-
real title. Executive officer.
Yeah, of course.
Executive officer.
I can. It's, I'm seeing it right there.
Anything, should we go back? Was there anything else before?
No,
this
I'm
last week?
fine.
Okay.
So I've got one more thing.
Okay.
This didn't come to our final conclusion, right? If you go to last year's report, there is a final conclusion, right? And the conclusion is it's negative assurance, but following the COC's mandate to review the 23-24 financial activities and work plan and give feedback to Florida, we conclude. This is what we said last year, right? Funds were managed and spent appropriately. The COC has no reason to believe that local and DSpace, we said the space programs are inconsistent with the agreement, as CNC has not observed the information suggesting the core projects for the year are misaligned with text measures. And so that was all a box. It said this conclusion is subject to successful follow-up on prior year local project recommendations 8, 9, 10, 11. And we didn't also say and the audit. I mean, we should also cover the audit. So that's what we said last year. Okay? So my suggestion is I would have all that language being the same with the negative assurance stuff, right? And then I would add, this conclusion is subject to successful continued follow-up on 22-23 recommendation number 8, the one that still remains open, and immediate resolution of significant recommendations throughout the 24-25 report. Because we have a lot of big stuff here, right? The audit slate, the crazy way that they've been doing all the D-space allocations, and there's some significant stuff in this year's report. The board should be briefed on all the findings monthly until they are successfully resolved. So we're saying we don't see anything wrong, but there's some stuff here that's getting kind of wobbly. You know, particularly with regards to the delay of the audit and no discussion at the board level. That's a big, big flag in the real world, in the broad world, right? You still haven't had a conversation with them yet on what happened.
Sorry, were
Oh,
you
yeah.
saying the COC should be briefed monthly? Who did
No,
you say? The
board.
board. Okay, and do they always meet monthly, or should we say should be
When they
briefed at
meet.
each meeting?
Fair enough.
And the delay was addressed by the board
Okay.
when they received the audit. The explanation for the delay was addressed.
Oh, so the board has received the audit? Oh, I missed that. Was that not also in the February meeting? There's the finance committee had that closeout. I watched that. There wasn't a
No,
lot
it
of
was, the audit was brought to them in June.
June. Okay.
My bad for not telling you.
Oh, that's fine. I could have watched. Yeah, so I was curious. So what was described?
The staffing challenges and some of the other things that were going on Southern Marin, the same letter that you saw from Chief Tubbs.
Oh, okay. Okay, and was there any discussion as to why there was no alert until a year later when the report was issued?
No, not really.
Okay, so you understand,
No, I do.
from my perspective, that's a real problem.
I do. I completely understand.
Right? So, you guys get what I'm saying? When an audit's a year late, that is a giant flag. And we've seen that in a number of cities in Marin when audits get late. Nevada versus. Okay, so, anyway, okay. So if you're good with that, I think we should add that.
Yeah, that conclusion box, yep.
Right. All right, this conclusion is subject to successful continued follow-up on that, item grade, and immediate resolution of significant recommendations throughout the 24-25 report. Didn't say that before, but I think we're trying to elevate, like, hey, stay on this.
Yeah.
The board should be briefed on all findings when they meet, until they are successfully resolved.
So we've reached the end of the report. Now, here's my question. How do we get from the draft that we have right now, the compilation, to what we can hand to Joanne?
So my suggestion is this. The first and most important step is that Mark has to complete his reconciliation of the audit and then populate it within the financial section as you choose. And like I said, you can either put it in one spot at the end or you can put it throughout. It kind of depends what you find. Okay. And then the D-space and local final numbers have to be put there. And then the next step is that someone's got to go through and look to make sure that we are all internally consistent throughout the document. Right? So the prior year numbers are equal to the prior year numbers. The roll forward on this year is the same as the roll forward on last year, or if it wasn't, that we described it isn't. And then that the description of things that we've looked at, like the one group looks at the 5 entities, and then you want to make sure that everything kind of everything all fits together. And then these edits that we've just been describing. So I would suggest that there be a subcommittee that does that. I'm willing to continue to do that. I think it'd be great to have a younger member who can pick up some knowledge, because I ain't going to be around forever. My term's over in December. Okay.
And
Well, my
term
only
is
concern
over
about the
in
subcommittee too is, yes, and the subcommittee just slows things down because people have to work together. I just,
Well, what
these were
happened
clear
last year?
edits.
Pardon me?
These were clear edits. I'm just wondering if anybody's gonna actually take the document and
I can do that.
Okay.
I can do the clear edits.
Okay, while we're
I
waiting.
need 2 sections from you.
Yeah, I've already changed them, let's get back to you. I put all this together in detailed notes, I shared them with Mark before, so he wasn't surprised.
Okay.
Done at 4:30
So it's
this
written
morning
somewhere
because
easy
I was
to
on-
incorporate. That's what I'm trying to figure out, how we get them incorporated into the.
Yeah, that's the easy
And
part.
then the audited stuff.
But that's the easy part. I'm happy to do the easy part.
Okay.
The hard part is what you guys are going to do.
Okay, how many people can we have in the committee? How many of us are there now?
You got
Seven?
3 of us.
We can have 3. So we're working together good. So we need one more. I would suggest either you or Scott because there's.
Yeah.
Jim's been a great student of stuff I told him, right? And he's picked it up. He's great. I said it's lucky that he became a doctor because he would have been a killer CPA. I've already told him that. Okay. So, I feel that, that you're still around next year, so there's been some transfer of knowledge and how this all kind of fits together.
Right.
So that
You'll
would
be here next year,
Through December.
Look at me.
I was only December, remember?
Well, yeah, but also
Rebecca
Thank you
too.
for being here.
the next item on our agenda is what our role is because you guys didn't figure that out.
Yeah.
At our last meeting. So, all right,
Okay,
anyway.
so
So should we volunteer Scott since he's not here?
unless Bruce wants it,
Unanimous.
I'm fine with anyway. I don't care. Just one of you.
Unless Bruce wants to.
Sounds like a good plan.
Would you like to be part of our little team of 3?
Do the same question, will I or would I like to?
Why don't you
I
and
think
Scott
that-
work that?
I
Yeah,
think it
what-
would be a good learning opportunity.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you're the chair.
Excellent.
You get to appoint this. So why don't
Yeah.
you work between the 2 of them and figure out what you guys want to do?
I think we've heard. I'm
You
gonna
don't
run with
count,
the volunteer right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So if the 3 of you can work together, that would be great.
Okay.
Take it.
And if, to be really direct about it, if we don't get the audited financials within a reasonable period of time, then I suggest we go to Plan B, which would be a very not a very good plan.
No.
Right?
Okay.
Because that would say we cannot reach conclusions because it's been a year and a half and we're throwing in the towel, and that makes the object. So
Okay.
a realist, I mean,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we've been kind. This has to be done. So.
Okay. So I think we do not need a motion. I think we can move on to our discussion items. Everyone ready? Which is, the next one is the committee foundational documents. And then we had the bylaws subcommittee report. John, I think the foundational documents piece, this is the recommendation to review the foundational documents and identify provisions that need updating. I think this was partly the sort of approach to how we review documents for the report.
Yeah, the plan, it's attachment planning scope, COC planning scope for 7/22/26. That is, I think if it is what I think it is, that's the thing I wrote a long time ago.
So time out. Are we skipping over 7B, which is the annual report and financial audit comparison?
We can't do it.
Why not? Because he hasn't done
I'm
it
still working with the auditor on that.
for 24?
Yes.
Oh,
And we certainly can't do it for 25 because the audit's just
Right,
been kicked
okay.
off. Okay.
okay. Okay, and so if we're on 8A, let's just regroup here. So yes, the first attachment, the onboarding attachment, is what John put together, which has been in our collective consciousness for maybe 3-4 months.
The one that starts approach to,
Yes,
yes.
yes. And then attachment right under it is, oh, I'm sorry. The first attachment is the onboarding welcome, which is the letter that I got from you guys when I first joined. And it was very helpful.
Mhm.
And I thought that in combination with John's document would be a fantastic way to expand the onboarding kind of orientation. So that's why those 2 documents are there.
Right, because I shared this with you when we were talking.
Yes,
And you went, ooh, this is pretty,
absolutely.
how we understand this, I think.
So,
Yeah.
do we want to go through that? We have 30 minutes. How do we've got I guess not a whole lot. Well, we also have the subcommittee report as well.
Well, we can keep putting that off. took a look at it and went through and did edits all the way through. There are only 4 or 5 issues in there that people have differing views about. So we can have it as our first item on the next agenda, or we can.
And I won't be here in August.
Okay.
Okay, well, so if people read the attachments, because we could go through the foundational documents pretty quickly unless we need to actually, I mean, I think the discussion was whether or not we needed to update these or if this was what we were.
Well, I think the bylaws are slightly different than.
Yes, the bylaws are different, yeah, and the first on the list here is the foundational documents. I think Jim was asking, do we intend to do both in the next half hour? I'd love to get through both if we could.
Let's try.
There's this recommendation to review the foundational documents, these 2 that came with the agenda, and identify any provisions that need updating, but maybe if they don't need updating and we're happy with them, we could.
So what, I know what one is, but I don't know what the second one is.
Onboarding and welcome for the planning scope.
That's,
So-
you wrote that.
Yeah.
Yeah, are you familiar with this?
Let's see, it's in there. I wrote it, so yes, I'm familiar with it.
And I know for me, the year before, the onboarding document was great too. You said that you would really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So unless there's some obviously big problems with it,
I
I
think
think
we
we can move on.
yeah.
And then as far as,
Yeah.
And then background and scope.
so the background scope, 2 meetings back, when I wanted to do this quickly, you wanted to like get into all periods and commas, and it frankly made me a little crazy. This
No,
document.
what I wanted to do was get the report ready to go.
So this was a negotiation. There were different people on the group then, and there's some stuff in here that I think is pretty much well understood now, but it needed to be put in at the time, and there's nothing inaccurate in some of those other elements that have been added. I could just go through, I have highlighted the important issues of this that I think are the ones that count. And I put them, I thought, did this show up bold and what was given?
Yeah, there's bold, but not highlight.
Oh, bold.
Bold shows up.
Okay, so go to page 2. So these are just based on my knowledge of how governance works. And I've learned a lot about it over many years, right? So these are just observations. There's not one place you can go to and say, how should an oversight committee work? In fact, sometimes there's a huge struggle because people don't know what to do. But first question, we cannot fulfill an oversight responsibility and also serve in a management function. In general, our role is to assess compliance with the tax measure and not second guess specific choices made by NWPA as long as they are allowed expenditures. This management function of deciding which allowed expenditures are made rests with the board, executive committee, advisory technical committee, and operations committees. We can also give feedback to the board as described in the ordinance on matters we observe in the course of a review, either formally or informally, but our main responsibility is one of assessing compliance rather than assessing operational performance. I think that's how we've done this, and in connection with what we just described on the Ranger thing, this is how it kind of fits. Like in 3 years, we've never said, hey, you really should have done that better. And then every now and then you can raise your hand and go, you might do a little bit better there. Next section is the finance track. The history of the finance track is that Larry Chu, brilliant man, who he's good at pivot tables too, went through the core data and created the financial report in the first couple of years. And look, everyone was swimming uphill. I mean, it's pretty impressive that you stood up a $20 million organization in 1 year. I mean, it's impressive what's happened. But a point came along and said, no, we're not the doers, we're the observers. So it was agreed that the audited financial statement should specifically contain all the elements in the finance track data report, including disclose of cumulative expenditures by zone and compared to the 80% and stuff. And we do not have to wait for the audit to be complete to issue our report. In the unusual case where the audit uncovers a material error, we would update our report. So that was what I wrote 2 years ago. And we're hopefully not going to have any unusual results. Then we went down the tracks. Okay, so there's a series of tracks.
plan, local projects.
Right, so we said, how do we do this, right? So, and I put some risk elements there. I said, okay, local project track is a higher risk area. And it's still evidenced by the fact that we are still unsatisfied with what the board's doing in terms of looking at the local information, right? I mean, we couldn't get those reconciliations where we were seeing the finding. We said, you really have to step up your game as far as local is concerned, but that's a higher risk area. So the funds are allocated to 17 different members, each with their own control environments, economic conditions, increasing the risk that all funds are not spent in specific accordance with the tax measure. The COC track will review MWPA staff records and efforts, beginning with 5 agencies and rotating selections annually. So that's how we've done it historically. There may be a time we want to change that, but that I thought was a logical way to do it. Members' plans for expenditures may change over the year, either spending less or more on an individual project, but actual expenditures are reviewed by MWPA. Oversight that any unspent funds are tracked and restricted for future work should also be subject to MWPA review. Our focus is on actual expenditures, compliance with the measure, analyzing the detailed differences between budget and actual expenditures as a management function subject to the board and not us. There's been a lot of, early on, we were always concentrating in budget. Who cares about budget, right? We're looking at the taxpayers' money and how it's spent on the actual side. So this is emphasis
I
that,
just keep using the budget because you don't see the real numbers for months.
right. But you can use the budget to do some of your preliminary work, but you should just concentrate on actuals. Okay. When we have a problem, we work with staff to obtain clarifying information for us to eventually conclude the existing diligence by the MWC is adequate or not, and whether we agree with the staff conclusion regarding the amounts and are reimbursable. COC inquiries do not drive NWPA staff oversight. We assess the adequacy of existing staff efforts. My point is that we don't make controls, right? We can make inquiries, but if he hasn't done the work, we're not going to have him do it. It's his job to do the work. It's our job to assess what he has done. We don't trade controls. If there are significant issues with the first 5, we may expand, might do something different in the future, but this is a foundational way to approach it. Okay, we can start with reviewing budget activities before year-end, particularly in core, and focus on the actual expenditures then to the voter. D-space, see, personnel with duties beyond D-space effort should only be reimbursed for their wildlife prevention activities. So that was the thing I wanted to break out. But, D-space theoretically would not be a particularly higher risk area. Turned out once we got into it, realized how the accounting was just a mess. That turned out to be a little different than I expected, but it is what it is. I think we really got D-space under good control at this point. Core is kind of interesting. The third track examines core. These payments are made directly to vendors or reimbursed to members for their supported expenditures by MWPA. They have greater board and committee oversight in the competition for funds between agencies. They all contribute to the oversight, right? Because everyone's competing for money out there, and that makes this a lower risk area. I believe that the local is the highest risk area, it's only 20%. Core is the lowest risk area, and it represents 60%. But there's so many eyeballs on it, at least for the big ones, we have a fair amount of good work there. So given this, we suggest that we look through stuff and see if anything's going to jump at us as being troublesome. These expenditures have 3 levels of committee and board review and the healthy pressure of multiple agencies competing for funds. This is a lower risk area given all the levels of review. The COC may want to drill down on a sample basis using a different approach this year, such as lowest expenditures that receive less board focus funding. We did that. We looked at the lowest numbers and said, what's that all about, right?
We did that last year, right?
It's all 1 year, because they were never done. Another one, we could focus on ones with highest staff payroll reimbursements in another year. We haven't done that yet. I think that's a good idea to do that at some point. Projects that are not, higher payroll reimbursements.
Oh.
So among one core, have them run how much of that core money is reimbursing staff. And that might be a signal like, oh, let's make sure that we're not paying for administration or for rangers who are not MWPA work. a risk-based approach. So, yeah, you can use some creativity there. Right? What happened this year, I believe, is you guys are into it, you've been doing this forever, you went through things and you didn't see anything jump out at you. So that's another approach. So that was that. The last one we had in this document was transparency, and we concluded that we don't need to cover that specifically anymore. So that was just.
I think it's great. I mean, I love this, and it's so nice to have it written out because I had heard you describe it verbally, but not actually seeing it in writing. But I think as in combination with the other sort of welcome, it's a really nice onboarding.
Yeah, I think it.
So I don't see anything that I would change.
What about taking out the transparency piece since we don't do it?
Yeah, you can
Yeah,
do it.
oh, well,
Sure.
we can definitely take that out.
Okay.
And
Okay.
can I ask a question, because I'm a little confused about this. Under tax measure review, there's a reference to the work program. Is that the work plan?
Yeah,
Yes, it is?
Yeah, I think so.
yes, it is.
Okay,
Just the work plan.
I guess I've been here over a year now. I don't remember ever looking at the work plan. Is that my being bad, or?
It's you're not going to enough meetings.
Yeah, I think that I think if you were in the it depends. So the operations review, it comes up all the time, and then also for doing the
And it's presented
local.
to the board of directors.
Yeah, and also operations because they talk it through.
Okay,
So-
but we don't discuss it here.
Well, core, it's all in core.
Yeah.
Oh.
It all exists in core. And that's the point, is that core gets the snot beat out of it. And then when we do our core review, because we know all this stuff's happening, we've observed all this stuff, we're spending more of our efforts on a risk-based approach, on local, most
Okay.
risky, D-space second source.
So another ignorant question is, the work plan that is presented this year, the work plan that was presented this year was for 26, 27.
Right.
And we're writing a report for 24, 25.
Right.
Yeah.
That is
How
always,
is that going to inform us on what we're doing?
Because
well,
we served for more than 1 year.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, when we're doing our report for FY 24, 25, shouldn't we be reviewing the work plan for 24, 25, which is 3 or 4 years old?
yes,
Yeah.
that's what we
And it
did.
exists online.
That's what you did in core.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we focused on the actual expenditures, not the plan. Because they might have a plan to do like a 5-city, what's it called?
Shade fuel break.
Shaded field break, right. That, that might take 10 years. So you focus on what the actual expenditures are.
We may have gotten one city of it done.
Right, exactly. But what you want the reason we look at that is to make sure that it didn't suddenly get diverted over to buying 5 more fire trucks or doing some fire roads, because wouldn't that be nice to have fire roads in there, right? Which is equivalent to this thing we had discussion with the homeless people and the tents burning. Yeah, so.
Okay, I'd find it helpful to, and maybe this is all obvious to you all, but maybe for somebody that's coming on, it might be good to spell out how we use the work plan. The work plan. So we look at the expenditures, we don't look at the budget, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I think it's good to know that there are 3 parts of the work plan. There's core, there's defensible space, and there's local. And, you kind of start from there, and then you look at budget and local, budget and what was spent, if there's a need to. Sometimes it's interesting to see how much they said they were going to spend
Right.
when you look
Okay.
at what they actually spent.
Right, so work plan is just budget. I'm just putting this all together, so.
Not just budget, it includes all the projects that are being proposed. So it's a document you have to read forever, long time. I mean, it's big, hundreds of pages.
And it's a result of a big battle, which is great, right?
Yeah.
Because everyone's fighting for the money, and they go through an extensive process to fight for the money and to see with the cream rises to the top, right?
It's not an easy process, and nor should it be an easy process.
And it's less of a discussion or argument now than it used to be, because as Mark pointed out, a lot of the budget now is last year, the projects were started 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and they're ongoing. So there's not a big explanation anymore about, or not as much of a big explanation anymore about some of the bigger projects. Everybody gets it.
Okay.
And there's the online work plan that's different than, well, not different than. It's a online version versus the PDF or Excel or whatever that file format is version that gets done after the operations committee has said, okay, here's what we're all recommending. Board, do you approve it? Yes. Now we're going to work in this document.
And that's on the website.
Exactly.
Okay.
So provisions, so I'm wondering on the planning scope document, if you want to add like an upfront sentence or something that like talks about the 3 different areas and the fact that this work plan exists, maybe as a reference with the, I mean, and it's not a question I know you're being,
No,
but it's not ignorant, it's fresh perspective and it's helpful to hear, so.
yeah, I'm just thinking, we get a new member to our committee, which would be wonderful. That would happen sometime soon. It would be nice to be able to say, okay, don't make the mistake that I made, which was I never looked at the work plan. You should, when your work starts on your COC report for this year, you go back and you hunt for the work plan for that year, and you familiarize yourself with your section that you're going to be writing, and that's your first step.
Oh, the interesting thing is that we are currently acknowledging a weakness with regards to the robustness of the work plan in the local area. Because it's like, hey, it's their money, I don't give a shit what they're doing with it. So it's getting poor visibility right now. And that was what I've been preaching all along is that, and I was great because Kohler said this at the last meeting, all of us, all 17, all of us are responsible for all the expenditures. And that was one point she made, which I was glad to hear her say. Right?
So maybe with a little addition, that would be a provision that would change, augment it, and then I think we're good because we've got the onboarding and welcome that doesn't necessarily need to change, do the planning scope, and then we'd have those materials for onboarding members.
Should these 2 documents be one document?
Probably.
So I'll volunteer to add what you've asked for and combine these documents and.
All in the same font even.
Would you like it to be on the website, accessible through the website?
That would be awesome.
Okay, we can look that up.
I think that would be great.
I haven't looked at the document. Does it specify? So normally when we bring somebody on board new, they get a buddy. I'm wondering if we ought to do also a collective study session to include guiding through the online version of the work plan versus, and that, here's how it looks in the very beginning, then here's how it looks when it starts to get actually used versus approved. Maybe we need to have something like that in the.
Rebecca, are you talking about the project tracking spreadsheet that
Yes.
we use? Okay.
And I'm guessing that's another issue is I don't use that term. So,
Oh, gosh, all of our documents. That needs to go in here. The rollover tables, the project tracking document, all of our different documents we had to look at, that needs to be.
like a
Yeah,
dictionary.
and there, in the original letter, the onboarding chair, we do have a bulleted list of some of those, but we might want to make sure we have that complete. And then if there were links in this document to those, they were hyperlinked, it would be really nice.
I'll just link to the prior year findings report. They're all in the line.
The tracking document is not.
No, that's in this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thinking that having Jim and Bruce maybe look at this as most recent being onboarded, how can we be ready for next And John and Pat don't think that you're really gonna be gone in December.
Yeah, Rebecca.
I'm trying to figure out how to offload.
Yeah, the bug.
Albatross. Okay. Thank you for combining those and adding. And then I think we can just share the final as an attachment next time around so that we all have it as a reference and it can get uploaded to the website.
Speaking of the consent item, just put it out and
Yep.
just say this
Consent
is,
item.
unless there's something you're offended by, let's just.
Yeah.
Get on with it.
That would be great. Okay, and then bylaws and how would you like to handle those?
You know, we have
6 minutes.
6 minutes.
We can do this.
Anyone want to approve? Motion? No, sorry. Just kidding.
I think that, you know, there are 2 or 3 issues, well, maybe 3, 4 issues that we need to talk about. But most of it is just kind of updating the writing style, and Bruce has done a nice job of going through it and reading that maybe this can be the first item on next month's agenda.
Yeah,
that we-
I mean, what's happened is, there's a first conversation, it was broad, there was no decisions made, then you said, let's make a subcommittee. Then the subcommittee came back and they provided, these are all options, but there are no recommendations, so we didn't really get very far. So hopefully, when we next see it, you are now forming recommendations that,
We have formed recommendations.
Okay.
For how to change it? Okay, great. So if we could get if it's ready to go, then it could be as an attachment to the agenda next time.
Yes, it will definitely be an attachment. It was an oversight that it wasn't an attachment this time, so we can't really vote on it.
Right.
But we can have it all ready. It's the first item on the agenda next
We
week.
have it.
Speaking of voting, you guys, we kind of got carried away with discussion of the COC report and all the edits you guys.
Yeah.
Technically, we should have a vote that you guys accept it, that you agree on the edits and who, how, and the process that you can move forward with it.
so I make a motion that all of the edits of which were described in today's meetings are accepted, and that there'll be a subcommittee of the 3 of us, which will deal with the open item of the financial report, and then review the document to make sure we're happy with the form of it. And we want to get it off to our production person. Realistically, you know, can you commit, like, we need to meet within the next 2 weeks to get this thing finished, right? To give enough time to get it out to the woman to do the turn it around. I mean, is it likely we'll have a draft report at the next meeting that we could vote on for publication?
I'm sure when it comes to the financials, I'm looking at the end of next week to be done with it.
Okay, so we want to get on your calendar with you in the next, give us dates that we need to get together so we can do this, right?
The subcommittee.
Yes, the subcommittee.
Yes. And do you need the subcommittee?
No, so for just really quickly, so for the subject of the motion, we have a motion from Member McCauley to approve item 7A, the compilation of local core and defensible space reports, as well as the formation of a subcommittee of 3 members who will review, who will perform document review before finalization.
And the remaining open item, the remaining significant open item, which is a reconciliation of the audited financial statements to the 22, 23, is that what it is?
23, 24.
23, to 23, 24, what's it called? It's called.
Roll over tables?
No, it's just called metrics or something. What do we call it? We call, financial oversight, background and metrics.
Okay,
The reconciliation too.
so the motion on the floor is to approve 7A, and then to follow will be a subcommittee as well as the reconciliation.
Approve 7A with discussed changes.
Approve 7A with the discussed changes, to follow subcommittee and reconciliation. And we've captured most of that for the minutes. maybe we'll just review the minutes at the next meeting to make sure we captured it appropriately. Can I get a second for that motion?
Yes.
I'm a little concerned about waiting until another meeting before we give it to Joanne.
No, we're gonna give it to Joanne within this time.
Okay,
Right, what we're doing immediately is he's gonna write up his financial
Okay.
review, and then he's gonna give it to us, and then we're gonna make sure it all fits, and then we're gonna make sure that, you're gonna take all the comments that we made today and update the document for it, and then we can all look at it to make sure we haven't missed anything, and then we get it off to Joanne.
Who asked the board chair for the letter? I can get
I do.
I can get my letter to
I
you.
take care of that.
Okay, if you want my letter next week, then I'll get it.
So for the purpose of the agendized item, we have a motion to approve 7A with the discussed edits, with a motion from Member McCauley and a second from Chair Biggs. I'll just do a quick roll call vote and then we can state for the minutes the follow-up actions. Starting with Member Suggs,
Yes,
Member Randolph,
yes,
Member Minikis.
Yes.
McCauley.
Yep.
Bartel,
Yes.
Wagner,
Yes.
and Biggs.
Yes.
So motion for item 7A passes. The follow-up actions for this motion is going to be the formation of a subcommittee as well as the reconciliation of,
Review of the
the
reconciliation
review.
prepared by staff.
the review of the reconciliation prepared by staff. So just for the purpose of capturing that in the minutes. And then we have a second item for vote, which was item 7B, 23-24 annual
That was
report.
tabled.
That is going to be tabled to the next meeting. So there will be no vote this afternoon.
Mark has links for both a near final version and one it's heavily marked up. And the logic of what we were going through as we were making the changes.
They've been forwarded to everybody.
Thank you.
And are we gonna have an August meeting? A lot of times,
I'm gone the entire month of August.
good for you.
Hope it's a fun place.
Sorry?
Hope it's a fun place.
Mediterranean.
Sounds fun.
It's gonna be hot.
So it's supposed to be August 26th, correct?
Yes.
I think we should be.
I think we should keep it on the calendar. for
Yeah.
now.
Right, we have to.
I was asking published.
Is that when is that when Jen assumes chair? August?
Yes.
Well, that goes back to her
August.
report. Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
Really? Oh, I thought it was January.
Yeah, I think it's January too, no?
I don't think so.
Well, we'll double
We'll
check.
go back and look, yeah.
Well, that's the whole thing of it, isn't it?
Okay, all right, any other future agenda items that we've not covered?
I have a question that's not a future agenda item.
Yes.
What is the criteria about when Larry and I can be gone?
Get back to the bylaws.
Well,
Stay tuned.
Wait till you see the bylaws revision.
Thank you so much.
Frankly, what I would say is that if you could do it one of two ways, depending on what your level of curiosity is, right? We've already fundamentally wrapped up our conclusions,
Yes.
with the exception of the potential for a big bomb with the audit, which Mark is telling me is not likely to happen. So, if you want to see it all the way to the end, come to the next meeting. If you're tired of this, then, both of you guys, I think that your work is done, isn't it? I mean,
Okay, thanks.
I'd love to see you at the next meeting.
Yeah, no,
And thank you,
Yes,
Rebecca and Larry.
yes.
part of the OGs.
oh, no, we're fine. Right, Rebecca, we're fine.
Okay, I
We're
think,
committed.
Oh, yeah, we're all committed.
No, I mean.
in a crazy way.
Right.
I think we can adjourn the meeting.
I second it.
All right.
Cookies were wonderful.
Yes,
Oh,
thank
good,
you.
I'm glad.